Hello, it's Dr. Kevin Sansberry with Nonprofit Connect. Today we're going to be investigating the topic of giving and receiving feedback. Let's talk about it. The term feedback is used to describe, both helpful information and or criticism about prior action or behavior. And this feedback can come from an individual, it could be communicated to another individual, it could also be communicated to groups. The purpose of this information that is given, whether it is communicated to an individual or a group, they use it potentially to adjust or to improve current future actions and behaviors. Unfortunately, for the most part, feedback is negative or delivered using a non-constructive approach, thereby making the majority of feedback non-productive. So with that being said, how we'll spend our time, the research as it relates to feedback is actually moving from a simple task-related practice to more of a dialogue and systemic approach. Therefore, today's conversation will focus on 3 parts. Starting systemically, how do we build a culture of feedback? Second, we're going to talk about how to give feedback. And third, how to receive feedback. So focused on building a feedback of culture, research shows that feedback and the influence of feedback on the receiver are most efficient and effective when it's offered in a structured and timely manner. It also helps when you build it off of a preceding series of feedback. So therefore, the person is used to receiving feedback on a regular basis. It's a part of what they expect. And so that makes it easier for someone to receive. So when we talk about building a preceding series of feedback, that implies that we have a learning culture. That implies that feedback is a regular part of our conversation, a regular part of communication with each other. And so you want to build a culture where employees learn to accept that mistakes are made inevitably, and any errors that occur in the workplace are utilized for learning. We don't vilify or ostracize when mistakes and errors occur in the workplace. So when you think about that learning environment, we're not only encouraging providing reliable feedback that's consistent, we're also talking about creating an environment where the feedback is meaningful. And this encourages and shapes positive attitudes across the organization. So the second aspect you want to think about as it relates to feedback is how do we integrate trust? And what you want to do there is that organizational culture should be generally non-threatening and supportive as it relates to communication and general relationships. Individuals are more inclined to ask for help and take risks when they feel psychologically safe and have trust in their supervisor and their coworkers and overall the work environment. So we've been talking about building an organization of feedback. I wanted to pause and give you a few aspects of feedback to think about before we tell you how to give feedback. I want to share with you some research around it to keep in mind. So the first thing to think about with feedback is there's a differential impact as it relates to feedback in the first place. So there was some research done that looked at shame. And what they found was supervisors' negative feedback is associated with an employee feeling shame at the person level. And what that did was increasing what's called end of work emotional exhaustion. Now, it also improved their next day in-role performance. Imagine that. But it did create a bit of shame and exhaustion as it relates to the emotional relationship between the supervisor and employee. And this typically happened when the relationship with that employee is actually stronger. And so what that tells you is, negative feedback that's given, we have to be very mindful of how we give it, because even when we have strong relationships with people and peers in the workplace, it still could increase shame. And so it's important of how we give feedback, right? The second aspect to think about from a research standpoint is the impact of gender. Gender bias in feedback does exist. There have been many studies that share this aspect. One study in particular shared that male raters provide harsher rater scores and shorter low-quality comments than female raters in the first place. So what this illustrates is it's important for us to, examine, again, the differential impact of any mechanism and every mechanism, but also it also shares that, it's important to have a model. And, as we think about how to give feedback to eliminate some of these differences. So let's pivot into how to give feedback. And I want to start with 2 cardinal rules to think about when you consider feedback in general. The first is, I'll just share a quote from Martin Luther King. It talks about, let's build bridges, not walls. And the intention of feedback is to build and strengthen others, not tear them down. So it's important as we think about our intentions and our mindsets towards giving feedback, we can kind of anchor towards building that bridge and not that wall. Second, focus on the issue or the behavior and not the person. So we want to focus on giving concrete, evidence as it relates to what's going on and being very specific about what we're giving feedback about, and not using feedback as a mechanism to serve for personal attacks and things like that, because that will muddy the waters and that feedback won't be received at all and it'll be viewed as an attack. So therefore you'd probably get a defense. So if we're trying to shape behavior, it's important that we focus primarily on the issues at hand. So let's pivot to talk about the model in question of how to give feedback as a start. So there are a lot of models. I'm gonna be honest. There are a lot of models on the internet that you can see a lot of acronyms and stuff like that of how to give feedback, yada yada yada. I'm kind of model agnostic, so I'm not gonna say like one model is better than the other. I am gonna share a model today, but it's just sharing it because it's simple and it's one that I've used in many contexts. The SBI framework was developed by the Center for Creative Leadership. And it outlines a simple structure that you can use to give effective on-the-spot feedback, whether it's at work, whether with your kids, whoever it might be. But SBI stands for Situation, Behavior, and Impact. And so when you think about giving feedback, you want to start with outlining the situation that you're referring to, because that person that you want to give feedback to needs to know the context. So you want to be clear and specific as it relates to what the situation is, right? Second, you want to be very mindful of, here are the precise behaviors that we want to address. Like, this is what we see. You want to be objective at this stage because you don't want to get into what you think happened or what you think the cause was. You want to be very objective, like, this is just what I observe. Because somebody can definitely tell you, well, how are you saying I was upset at the customer? I wasn't upset with the customer. They can argue that. But what you could say is, I heard you yelling, or others reported that you were, those are behavior, right? Those are very objective, because you don't want to get into like a perception battle of like, oh, you didn't see that, yada, yada, yada. You don't, how do you know I was mad? Or how do you know? You don't want to get into that. You want to be very objective about what you perceived, because they can't tell you your perception is wrong. They can tell you or provide you context, but you perceived X, right? And so you want to stay out of being subjective with your perception and just strictly go to what you objectively can measure, what you can objectively hear, see, things like that, right? And lastly, you want to share the impact of that person's behavior on you or on the team or on the organization, on the customers, whatever that might be. Because again, you're sharing the impact of it, meaning this is what happened, right? Cause and effect, right? And so you're going to stay very objective as it relates to feedback. And this is kind of cut through and control for potential miscommunications, defensiveness, things like that. There are a lot of times we talk about impact and intent, impact versus intent. We talk about that a lot in a lot of contexts. And so when you think about, SBI has impact in there, intent could matter, right? And so what you want to do is ask the person, based on my observations, based on what I saw, hey, tell me what your intent was. I heard you yelling, I saw you yelling, whatever it might be, you saw something, right? And this was the impact, people were kind of afraid or whatever, right? What was your intentions behind that? And just ask a question. One of the number one rules that I talk about related to leadership is just maintain that curiosity and openness. And so asking, someone their intent could provide you and help you uncover, the behavior underneath all of that. It can help you uncover that. And so really important to factor in that as well. That's not part of the SBI, but the Center for Creative Leadership recommends adding that intent at times, depending on the context. So they do SBI-I. So yeah, very helpful there. Now let's get into the aspect of receiving feedback. Because like I said, there are a lot of models that tell you how to give feedback, but I wanted to spend a little bit of time, at least today, sharing receipt of feedback, because a lot of times the recipient of feedback, we want to be mindful not to be defensive and be mindful to be in that stance and that state of reception. So I want to share with you a few helpful reframes as it relates to how to receive feedback. So the first one is, criticism is information. So what that means, as you think about that, is criticism is simply information, positive, bad, whatever it might be, negative, positive, negative. It's information nonetheless. You have a choice. You have a choice to take that information in or not. And so as you think about, your approach or your stance as it relates to receiving feedback, view the criticism, whatever it might be, the critique, whatever it might be, simply as an input and as information, as data. Okay? The second reframe is, View feedback as a gift. The person or persons who decided to give you feedback, in some cases, didn't have to. And sometimes we miss out on gifts that are given to us due to us in being in disbelief, or us being in a state where we are in defensive mode. And so we don't hear or see anything for self-improvement. And so you have to let go of that perfectionism, because no one's perfect and mistakes do occur. And so be mindful. If you reframe feedback being a gift, you'll be more receptive to receiving a lot of gifts and not viewing it as a threat. The last reframe I'll share is actually a Zen proverb, and it talks about let go or be dragged. And I really like that proverb and that quote as I think about feedback, because when we receive feedback, there are a lot of things we can't control. And it's really helpful to focus solely on what do I have control over? What can I actively control? Because we try to hang on to things that we can't control, and that tends to bog up our mind and, perpetuates anxiety. But it's important for you to understand that, like, when you take on feedback and when you have criticism that comes to you, pick the things that you have control over, low-hanging fruit, and start there. You can't change everything in one day, but you can say, you know what, look, this is what I can control, this is where I'm going to start, and this is what I want to see. And so main importance there to think about is letting go of the defensiveness, letting go of the, purposeful, I'm going to put this tunnel vision on and not see my own behavior, letting go of that and being, in that state of, receipt and reception, because I view feedback as a gift, right? And so I want to thank you for our conversation related to feedback. Hopefully, as we think about building that culture of feedback and engaging in a structure, engaging in a system of feedback, communication, transparency, we can all see positive outcomes in our interpersonal relationships. So thank you. I'm Dr. Kevin Sansberry, signing off.